let me invite you.
Thank you, Ashley. The comments I'm going to make are not limited to what is in the chapter. There's nothing you can write on China's economy that is still up to date 2 weeks later. So I'll take advantage of the developments that have occurred in the 2 months or so since the chapter was written. And I'll do that in the form of 10 or 7 or 8 short points. First point is what was China's response to the crisis? Very briefly, the response was very quick, very strong, and very effective. As we now know, China's official reported growth rate for the first half of the year was 7.1% year on year. So that's over the first half of 2008. That's extraordinary, given where they were at the end of 2008. That doesn't mean, and if growth was all that matters, of course, China would be out of the woods and we would all applaud and go home and think this is it. As I will explain later, this is not the end of the story. There are many questions, of course, about the sustainability of this growth pattern. But there's no question that they were very quick on their feet. Already at the beginning of November, they launched a major stimulus program, which turned out to be monetary in nature than fiscal, even though it was presented as a fiscal program. I calculated, based on preliminary numbers for the first half of the year, that the incremental stimulus nature spending in the first half of the year was about 85% monetary and 15% fiscal. The rebound, as we call it, was, I think, more impressive than even optimists had dared to predict 6 or 7 months ago. But as I mentioned, growth is not all there is to talk about. The pattern of growth is very important. And if you look at what happened in that first 6 months of the year, you'll quickly understand why this is not sustainable. This was all stimulus-financed, credit-driven, state-sponsored investment. Consumption, I think, contributed. I'll talk a bit about consumption in China later on, but this is an unusual situation. Of course, stimulus programs are unusual, but if you make a calculation, as I did, it turns out that more than 80% of the growth, well over 80%, perhaps as much as 90% of the growth in the first half of the year was accounted for by investment. Now, that's more than double the already very high rate of 42, 43% that China's investment GDP ratio was in recent years. So we have a crazy situation. And unless the non-state sector takes over with investment that is not state-driven and not necessarily financed from state banks through additional credit expansion, this model is not sustainable. Fortunately, we see the beginnings of a more sustainable recovery because the non-state sector is responding in a forceful way. And every week that goes by, we see more evidence of that. So most analysts, including myself, are now reasonably confident predicting an 8 to 9% growth this year and perhaps 9% plus growth next year. The reason why I think this program was so effective, I think are worth focusing on for a moment. Why did China had such a V-shaped rebound recovery, whereas the US is still at a very low level of recovery? Number one, the Chinese economy was not over-leveraged when the crisis hit. That means all the incremental spending, fiscal and monetary, led almost immediately to incremental aggregate demand in the economy. In the US, the stimulus program compensates at best for the deleveraging that's going on in the private sector. That's why the US economy cannot rebound as the Chinese economy rebounded. Question of the leverage level prior to the crisis. Second reason, Chinese government fiscal situation was very strong when the crisis hit, and the banks were very strong. 10 years ago, China's banks were perhaps the weakest in the world. Today, they are amongst the best. Very well capitalized, much better managed than they used to be. All are accounted, their accounts are all by international standards now. They all engage international auditors, so it's a very different story. And they had ample liquidity at the start of the crisis to respond to the government's call for additional lending. Very different story from the US. Perhaps most importantly, in China's political system, it's very important to know whether the interests of local governments and central governments are aligned or not. If they are not, Beijing can talk until it is blue in the face and nothing much is going to happen. In this particular case, there was perfect alignment of interest between the center and the locals. Everybody wanted to get out of the trouble and use the funds. That's an unusual situation for China because most troubles are due to conflict of interest between local and central governments. As a result of the crisis, is my next point, it's probable that China's political and economic rise in the world will accelerate. Their prestige has been enhanced in the developing world. They're obviously much more confident today about their economic model than they were even 12 months ago. We see that, for example, in the interaction between the Chinese delegations at the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which the last one took place, the first one under the Obama administration took place in May, and that was a clear demonstration of the renewed self-confidence that the Chinese now have. They pride themselves in not having followed the advice of Mr. Paulson for accelerated financial sector reform and accelerated opening up of the capital account, because they might have fallen into the trap if they had. I spent a fair amount of time in the chapter on the question, as we discussed already in the first session, to which extent these global trade imbalances and by implication China's exchange rate policy are responsible for the crisis. I come to the conclusion that yes, these imbalances did contribute to the excess liquidity in the US banking system as a result of the tremendous reflow of cash from the saving surplus countries, but we cannot point to that as a root cause of the crisis. If the Fed had been on its feet, it would have noticed these things and it could have sterilized the excess liquidity if they had wanted to. That's what the Fed is for. Nobody seemed to think it was a problem at the time. So it's a bit contrived, I think, to refer to these imbalances as a root cause of the crisis, and by implication, you cannot refer to China's exchange rate policy as a root cause of the crisis, as some very prominent journalists in this town have done. Incidentally, as I mentioned very briefly, I believe that China's large surpluses were due to more than exchange rate policy. The major factor, much more important in my view than the exchange rate, was the fact that they had such tremendously high productivity growth in manufacturing, especially from around the turn of the century onward. Colossally fast, both labor and total factor productivity, so fast that they could never have compensated the nominal exchange rate to compensate, to allow for that relative productivity gain. And therefore, to some extent, China's currency undervaluation and trade surplus was, to some extent, an unavoidable byproduct of their very aggressive domestic economic reforms. The Chinese, of course, know very well that their economy is very unbalanced, and this particular stimulus-created recovery pattern is unsustainable. Everybody in Beijing talks about it these days. That doesn't mean they can actually easily change it. There are very difficult challenges ahead, and these challenges are both on the demand side and on the supply side. On the demand side, of course, their consumption growth has been way below GDP growth for a long time. That means that the share of consumption in GDP has gone down all the way to 35% in 2007, the lowest in the world, perhaps. But if you look at the numbers more closely, you quickly see that the rate of consumption growth in China is not a problem because it's the highest in the world. China had much higher consumption growth even than the over-consuming United States. China's problem was GDP was growing even faster and that the share goes down. There's nothing wrong with China's consumption growth, which is believed to be somewhere between 9 and 10% now. So if GDP growth goes down to, say, 8, 9%, I think the time will solve that problem. A much more serious problem facing China, in my opinion, is on the supply side. The crisis has bared tremendous excess capacity, insignificant manufacturing sector, and as a result of that, the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, has now instructed the relative ministries and agencies to come up with medium-term restructuring plans for 10 major manufacturing subsectors. steel, non-ferrous metals, shipbuilding, automobiles, heavy chemicals, textiles, and a few others. Now, this is an illustration of the realization in China of the problem. That doesn't mean they can do it, because China has become a very pluralistic society, and restructuring manufacturing sector is painful for those who have to close down. So don't expect that to be an easy. So I see the problem not so much on the consumption side, but on the supply side. That is the real challenge, whether they can do it or not. Just in the remaining minute, two very short comments on China and Taiwan. I believe the crisis, again, of course, unintentionally, has accelerated economic integration in greater China between Taiwan mainland and even Hong Kong and mainland. Taiwan exports to mainland and Hong Kong is now more than 3 times as high as Taiwan exports to the United States, which used to be the main trading partners. Taiwan enterprises on the mainland were given preferred treatment by state banks in response to the crisis. You all know the Dalai Lama visited Taiwan recently, which caused hardly a ripple in Beijing. That's a very interesting indication. And there are many other indications of improving relations between Taiwan and the mainland, possibly to the point where a formal peace agreement to end the civil war of 45-49 comes on the horizon. That doesn't mean that a political solution is a long-term political solution is on the horizon. But I think we can take Taiwan off the list of acute problem countries that might endanger peace in Asia and might involve the U.S. militarily if we want to avoid it. U.S.-China relations, I think, will not change very much as a result of the crisis. China is much more confident, but that doesn't mean that they don't see the need to have very good constructive relations with the U.S. They will take SNED and other fora of this kind very, very seriously. The last thing China wants is trouble with the United States. The U.S. will remain very, very important to China for a long time to come. But in the meantime, China will make efforts to reduce its dependence on Western and U.S. consumer markets by promoting South-South trade and by investing more in resource-rich countries, particularly in Asia, Latin America, Africa, Canada, Australia. These are the main beneficiaries. This flow of outward investment from China has now become so big that I wouldn't be surprised by the end of the year the outflow of FDI from China will exceed the inflow for the first time. And that's a major thing because the amounts are absolutely huge. Will China change its growth model? I don't think its economic model. Of course, the state has temporarily become more important in the economy, more so than they intended. Many people have concluded from that China is going back on its market reforms. I don't think so at all. In fact, the relative role of the state in the U.S. economy has increased more than the relative role of the Chinese state in the Chinese economy. So I see absolutely no indication that there's any fundamental rethinking of the market reforms. This is simply a temporary delay of certain reforms, nothing more than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pieter.